Hi, I'm very excited to be moving into this next unit in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, which is one I've been looking forward to doing in Radical Bible since I started, because there's just so much exciting things going on here. Not just in the plot of what's going on with David and Bathsheba and Uriah and Joab and everything else that's going on in this twisty plot in these chapters, but also how many gaps there are, how much open space there is, so that the readers have to find interpretations based on little data. And we'll see that leaves some wide open spaces for trying to understand the story that challenge us to look at our own presuppositions and see how much are we reading this in terms of what we want it to say, or we expect it to say, and how much in terms of when we look close what is actually being said. So we're going to take our time here. In this introductory video, I just want to cover some of the wider territory that shapes the whole unit here, and then we'll begin to look at the details next video. So you can see on the right side of the screen I have this little list of some issues interpreting 2 Samuel 11 and 12, and this is just some, because there are 31 of them here, and there's actually more because some of those have double questions, and we'll get to some of these details later, but I want to look first in this video at some of the overall things at the beginning here in these first sections, starting with where does the unit start and end. And if you've been following this sequence, you might note that I did the last unit on 2 Samuel 8 to 10, and I noted in the introduction of that section that 10 could go either way. So I won't go back over 10. I'll really focus here on the unit 11 and 12, and that's what we're going to look at. And we can see a certain structure of that right here. And this shape here, and I note a structure. I also didn't call it a chiasm. It's shaped like a chiasm, but it's not precisely a chiasm, but it's close enough to one that we can look at it this way. And I titled this chart Character Assassination, which is a term that Polson used, noting the different characters who are killed in a sense, whether that's Uriah literally or David's reputation in the story here. So that's his little explanation for this. And he notes in his wonderful, groundbreaking book back in the 80s on this section, he says, if 1 Samuel 9 to 10 was a meditation on the rights and duties of the prophet, which is to say Samuel, as they pertain to the rights and duties of the king, which is to say Saul, 2 Samuel 11 and 12 is a meditation on the modes and functions of messengers, who are not named here, as they pertain to the rights and duties of kings, which of course means David. But it also means more, as we're going to see. So one of the things to be looking at in terms of shaping the structure, in terms of saying that 11 and 12 is a unit, is the fact that it begins and ends with the battle against the Ammonites in the same place in Rabbah. I didn't put Rabbah on here, but you can see on the left side of the screen, verse 1, notice it besieged Rabbah, and we'll see that again in the closing frame there. One of the questions we're going to have to look at is all of this taking place within that war, and has a war been going on all that time? And we'll look at that in just a minute. But we can see that after the opening frame, it starts with David and Bathsheba and the conception of the unnamed child, and at the end is David and Bathsheba and the conception and birth of Solomon, also known as Jedediah, as we'll see. It follows in the pink part with David and Uriah, with the note that Uriah lies in the ground and won't eat. And then in the David and Yahweh parallel in chapter 12, David lies on the ground and won't eat. And then these parts are not exactly parallel, but they certainly fit within the shape here, that David sends messengers back and forth with Joab to have the conversation about what to do about Uriah. And on this side, Yahweh speaks through Nathan to tell David about the consequences of behavior. So here, messengers are the intermediary, and here Yahweh is the intermediary. Or I guess Nathan is the intermediary between Yahweh and David. And at the center is Yahweh saw that it was evil. And that's the first time we're hearing that about David. And as people like Baruch Halpern have shown in great detail in his now classic book from 2001, David's Secret Demons, he suggests that the whole David and Bathsheba incident is a smokescreen to hide us and distract us from David's bigger crimes of mass murder and lying over assassinations and other things. So that's something we're going to have to look at as we go. Going back to look at the overall issues, so the question of whether it's part of the original David story or added later, scholars disagree about that. Some, like Bailey, go as far as to suggest it was added after the Absalom story that goes from 2 Samuel 15 to 19 as an explanation of how that happened. We may look at that a little bit as we go, but that's the most radical view, that it's completely out of order. Some have suggested that it was not out of order chronologically, but inserted in here to explain what follows after. I don't see see that myself. I'm going to treat it like it's been part of the story all along, and we'll see there are a number of links between these chapters and other parts that suggest that the story would certainly not be complete without it. The third one here is, do the events that frame the story, as I was just showing the Ammonite War, fit the chronology of the story? And that's one of the issues we have to look at in the mysterious element of time passing here. So it starts with a very specific time reference. You can see on the left side as well on the chart here on the right side, the spring of the year or the beginning of the year there, when somebody goes out to battle. We'll look at that in a minute. And then we find very soon Bathsheba becomes pregnant. So for her to know she's pregnant, we assume will take probably 2 months from the incident, having missed her period and recognized that wasn't an aberration. And then Uriah is sent to his death, but how long does that process take? Bathsheba has the child, so certainly that's 9 months or something close to it between the beginning of the chapter and the end of the chapter. Then in chapter 12, Nathan confronts David, but how soon after is that? We don't know. The child sickens and dies after 7 days after Nathan tells David that Yahweh struck the child dead but won't strike David dead. Is that immediately after? We don't know. Then we suddenly hear that Bathsheba has another child, so the entire pregnancy goes by in just a verse. And so that suggests that 2 years perhaps have gone by, and then we get back to the war. And the only other reference we get in the beginning of chapter 13 is the vague notice that some time passed. So plainly, the authors are not worrying about the chronology or presenting in a tight story something that's happening over a couple of years, which leaves a huge gap in the story of what's going on in the interim spaces. Like, what was Bathsheba's second pregnancy like all that time? But of course, we know nothing about that and can only guess. So returning to our list of overall issues here, is the perspective on David and monarchy here consistent with earlier or later sections, or is it different? And we can only evaluate that once we look at the chapters, but plainly the fact that it says Yahweh accuses David of doing something evil, and there can't be any audience then or any time in between, he didn't see something's not right about David taking this wife of his general, or at least of a member of his army, and then having her husband secretly killed. So certainly that can't be viewed positively by anybody. But is it consistent or not with what we see about David earlier? And is it about kings in general, around the issue of taking that we saw in 1 Samuel 8 6 times, that kings take? Or is it something else? So we'll have to explore that a little bit as we go. And then, interestingly, I hope you'll think, I do, what's the relation between this story and some other stories? For example, in 1 Kings 21, where Jewish scholar Jacob Chinitz just shows a complete list of the parallels between 2 Samuel 11 and 1 Kings 21. And I won't go through this all in detail, but you can see by the objects of them, and he shows that these are very parallel, and that's all I'll show you on that. He doesn't analyze it, he just shows the parallels and wonders whether the story of Ahab and Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21 is the same story as David. Which one came first? And we won't address that. But that's one of the ways in which the story echoes other stories. We can also see this one that Isaac Kalimi wrote about in 2016, between the parallels between our story and the fall and the judgment on Samuel in 1 Samuel 15 that we can see here. So David is challenged by Nathan as Saul was challenged by Samuel, and you can see the parallels there, including the response in 3 steps that are similar and different here. And as Kalimi notes in the blue box below, in addition, both stories, the story of Saul and the Amalekites and that of David and Bathsheba, start with a historical exposition, and you can see the references there. And both stories recount that the Israelite kings defeated the enemies and took booty from them. So those are some interesting parallels between the turning and the fate of Saul and potentially the turning and the fate of David. But we can also see similarities here between the story we're looking at now and David's encounter with Abigail and Nabal back in 1 Samuel 25. And again, I won't go through all these here, but you can see how many parallels there are, including the rare reference that both women are described as beautiful, although it's a different word in Hebrew. The great contrast between Nabal, whose name means fool, and is described openly by the narrator as surly and mean, whereas Uriah is implicitly described, never explicitly said so, as a faithful servant to Yahweh, even though he's a Hittite, and a faithful soldier to his fellow soldiers and to to Joab. And then we see that while Nabal sends an insulting message to David, Uriah speaks respectfully to David. But both women come to David, and away from the women, David plots revenge. Whether he's plotting death against Nabal isn't clear. He doesn't literally kill Nabal. Nabal falls down dead after he's drunk, but it certainly suggests the possibility to people like Halpern and others. But he openly plots Uriah's death, and we know how that happens. If you don't know, you'll find out. In great contrast, Abigail brings a large present and the longest speech by a woman anywhere in the Deuteronomistic history, but Bathsheba is utterly silent. Nabal gets drunk on his own and dies, and David gets Uriah drunk to try to get him to have sex with his wife, but he refuses. And Michal, this is a mistake there. That should be Abigail, and I'll correct that before I post it at radicalbible.net. Abigail becomes David's woman. Michal already was David's woman, and then Bathsheba becomes David's woman. But in the first story, neither the narrator nor characters comment, and in the second one, we have the explicit judgment by Yahweh on that. So that's another one. And then, as I was showing in my Genesis 34 series, in the Genesis Radical Bible set, these interesting parallels between Shechem's taking of Dinah in Genesis 34 and David's taking of Bathsheba here. And I went over that in great detail in the Genesis series, and I won't go over it all now. But you can see just how many parallels there are, not just in our immediate passage, but about building a house earlier. But we see all these parallels here. And similarly, the troubles that follow. And in my reading of the chronology of writing, the David story is earlier, and the Genesis story is exilic or post-exilic, maybe in the time of the Persian hegemony over the restored Judah and its temple. And it could well be the Genesis story is a comment on the David story in that way, and we'll look at that more as we go as well. And so those are the major issues overall, but I want to just pay some attention to the more specific issues so we can really see why we have to go into great detail. And I'm not going to go over this in detail now. As I said, I'll do this next time, but I want to highlight some of the questions. Some of this, as we always see, are translations, but some of this, as Meyer Sternberg, who's really the leader on the idea of the Hebrew Bible having gaps in knowledge that are intentional and require people to fill them in. This is a very gappy story. Some of it is ambiguous in ways that cannot be resolved. For example, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, and as you can see here, Malachim for messengers or Melachim for kings is very close, and different manuscripts have either one. And so it can be either way. And I'd like to suggest that's one element of our interpretation that, just like with Genesis 34 and its ambiguities, we can read it more than one way, and we should to imagine the story in parallel outcomes. But sometimes we can resolve that because there are ambiguities that are only ambiguous because of translation. So, for example, the question of what David sees here and where she is will be one that we're going to look at. And what is described in verse 4, she purifying herself after her period. Most scholars who've looked more closely at this, especially, well, we'll look at the details when we get there, have said, no, the language here is not about a period, it's about something else. So those are just examples of why we have to go closely into this. And we also have to look at characterization. And one thing I'd like to pause on just for a moment, we'll look at it in more detail later, is how both scholars writing and artists painting have gone from wanting to defend David as God's holy and chosen king, and therefore blame Bathsheba. After all, the Hebrew Bible in the religion of empire parts, which this is a part, often blames the women, as it does in the end of this story when in 1 Kings 11 it blames the loss of Israel from the united monarchy on Solomon's foreign wives leading him astray. And we have no sense that Bathsheba is a quote-unquote foreign wife, although her husband is a Hittite, and he's certainly not by that as an Israelite, and it's repeated many, many times, as we'll see. There is really nothing in the text that says on its own that Bathsheba is tempting David in any way, and a lot to suggest that David is using his power as a king to take what he wants. And so older scholarship blamed Bathsheba, as did older art. And let's just look briefly at a couple examples of how art has shifted in portraying Bathsheba, so we can see how some of our presuppositions might be at issue. So first, let's look at this one from the artist Cornelis, which is undated as far as I could find. But notice the widespread nudity here. And as one article analyzing Rembrandt's paintings in relation to the story has noted, the story gave artists in the late medieval and early Renaissance period an excuse to be around and paint naked women. And there's no doubt that that was why this subject is so repeated in art. If you go to databases on the internet, you can see there are more paintings of David and Bathsheba, or just of Bathsheba, than almost any other topic that I could find. But nothing in the text says that she's naked or that he can see her naked. And yet that's what we also see in the earliest version of Rembrandt's painting, which is lost. This is following Rembrandt from 1632. And it also shows her naked. And I'm not an art critic or an art historian, and I won't take a lot of time on it, but notice how you can see her in this one versus this one from a decade later. The one in 1632 might have well been painted many decades earlier, but the version you just saw is 1632. This one from 1643, where she's also naked, but as the interpreter in the article says, suggested more vulnerable there. And then finally, in the last one here, from 1654, he clothed her. And you see the old woman there at her feet who's attending her, in contrast with the young naked women we saw in the first one. So it's more respecting her at this point. And I could show a lot more, and you could certainly look for a lot more. Another way this has been portrayed this way is in film. And there are two major films in the 20th century about David and Bathsheba. This one here, you can see the poster starring Gregory Peck, Susan Hayward, and then this one a couple decades later with Richard Gere, just about King David. In both of those, the interesting challenge is not that Bathsheba is somehow trying to seduce David, but there's something wrong with Uriah. Either that he's a bad, abusive husband, or that Bathsheba sees something in David that her husband doesn't have. And so it's just interesting how portrayed as not a romantic comedy, but certainly a romance between David and Bathsheba, which we don't see much of in the text itself. And whether through art or through movies, that imagery has often affected people's reading of this before we get to the story, to either assume that David is looking at a naked woman, or that Bathsheba may be responsible for her own taking in that sense. As a number of scholars have noted, and especially writing from a lesbian feminist perspective, around the question of the male gaze. And the article around the Rembrandt piece that I noted was suggesting that the naked exposure of Bathsheba implicates the audience, especially men in the audience, for whatever pleasure they might have or whatever shame they might have in looking upon her nakedness in that way. And so it certainly draws us in that we are responsible for our own response in seeing this naked, vulnerable woman taking a bath or otherwise being in her privacy that we're spying on. So that's something we're going to have to look at. And just to glance through a few more of these so we can see the scope of them. What about Uriah the Hittite, who's an important character here, and yet he has almost nothing to say, and yet he seems to go along with the whole thing. So that's something we need to be paying attention to. And all the questions of knowledge, which can play out who knows what, who thinks they know what, as we can see. What do we imagine Uriah knows, and what do we imagine David thinks Uriah knows? And it plays out in many possible permutations. So we're going to have to look at that, including the role of Joab. Does Joab even know about the Bathsheba incident? He's been at the war the whole time. So we'll have to look at how the messengers are conveying that back and forth. But we're also going to look in chapter 12 at the so-called parable. I put it in quotes because when we get there, we'll have to discuss, is it a parable or something else, that Nathan tells David. And nobody better than Robert Polson shows the depth of meaning of this story, which I've expanded. So you can see here in the yellow part, that's Polson's part, and the cite to him is down below. In the immediate plot here, he sees that David is the rich man, and Uriah is the poor man, and Bathsheba is the ewe lamb that David takes away and gives to Judah, a kingdom, as a recipient of David's offspring to be king, which is to say Solomon. And I won't go over all these now, and I will later, but note how many levels of the story from the very beginning to the very end this little parable fits. I'll just show a couple of examples so we can see. So in the conquest story, we see that Yahweh is the rich man who takes Israel, or the land that becomes Israel, from the Canaanites who don't have Yahweh, and gives it to Israel, takes the land of Canaan rather, and gives it to Israel. At the other end, we notice the flip side, is that Yahweh takes the land from Israel and gives it to Assyria and Babylon. And so Yahweh is the ultimate rich man in the story here. But we see that also plays out in the role of Saul and the role of Yahweh here. And my exclamation marks there, the surprising element in three of these, it's David who becomes the poor man, who has his daughter taken away and given to his son Amnon, has his concubines taken away by his son Absalom, and has his his body-warming young beautiful woman near the end of his life taken away by Adonijah. And so we'll see how it comes back on David. And so Poulsen shows this is the master metaphor for the entire Deuteronomistic history, not just for this situation here. And we'll have to play out what that might be saying about how whoever the author of 2 Samuel 12 is, about monarchy in general, about David in particular, and about the role of Israel among other nations. The last thing I want to look at here is just the key words for the chapters. So again, as Poulsen and others have noted from the beginning, messengers are key, and so we see that throughout. But if I make this smaller so you can see the whole chapter, I know you won't be able to read the whole thing there, we can see that in addition to the names of people, it's not surprising that David and Joab and Uriah are there so much, but Uriah is often mentioned, Uriah the Hittite, Uriah the Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. And then there's other little repetitions that are not necessarily key words but phrases. Notice how many times we hear that Uriah did not go down to his house. 4 times in this paragraph here. It's not really a chiasm, but 4 times we're told Uriah did not go down to his house. He is not the father of the child. And so we see a woman here repeated throughout. Bathsheba is hardly mentioned by name just that one time at the beginning, and then she becomes the wife of the woman of Uriah, or just the woman. But chapter 12, as you know, chapter 11 ends in the middle of a sentence, so there really was not a break there, and it starts here. And we see how it shifts. So Joab is not here, but Nathan is here now. And we see the issue in these 2 chiastic units here of the taking, repeated again and again, and the issue of David eating food or not eating food and fasting or not fasting there in this chiastic shape here. And again, ending, as I was noting, the overall with the return to the battle against the Ammonites in Rabbah, and David and all the people return to Jerusalem. So that's the shape of our story and some of the questions we're going to look at. And so buckle in for the long journey here through these 2 chapters, and we'll continue next time with the beginning in chapter 11. See you then. Bye.